Aloha, this is Carrie Kim. Listeners, thank you for joining us today. Our guest today is Yves Zender, who comes to you live from the mountains of Ecuador. He's joining us today to share his intrepid journey to live a simple life as a steward of degraded lands, and he has been actively helping to regenerate and reforest these lands for the last nearly 2 decades. We thank the Tongva ancestors for their enduring legacy, presence, and stewardship of this area. Our show comes to you from the ancestral lands of the Tongva and all of their relatives. And we invite you to ally and align with local First Nations and support their homelands and lifeways wherever you live. A simple life. Many of us dream of this, especially those of us living with endless amounts of technological conveniences and gadgetry, bombarded by a daily onslaught of unnatural sights, sounds, smells, and information, perhaps disheartened by the ways of the modern world. But what does it take to actually live a simple life as nature? Yves Zender joins us today to tell us how he ended up off-grid, off-road, and offline in a quest to do just that, live simply, to be a conscious contributor rather than an extractive consumer, a homesteader with a far smaller than average footprint. He founded Sacred Sueños in 2004, a mountain regeneration project close to Vilcabamba in the Andes Mountains of southern Ecuador. He's here to inspire us with his journey to create a home defined by regeneration, biodiversity, an abundant, thriving ecosystem. Through permaculture, analog forestry practices, restoring soil fertility, natural building, appropriate technologies, regenerative design and agriculture systems, animal integration, agro-ecology, and intentional community. Becoming one with and adapted to nature by being as nature is a life-transforming journey, and you just may wish to undertake it yourself. Welcome, Yves, dear friend, at long last meet.
Yes, it's so good.
Many thanks for coming down off the mountain and joining us from Ecuador. We know it's late for you, and this is your inaugural Zoom.
It is.
Let's start at the beginning. Why and how? Why and how did you end up in Ecuador? Tell us a backstory of Sacred Sueños.
All right. Well, it started in university where I was studying environmental studies, and it was 4 years of learning about everything that was wrong with the world, every single problem that society has, and how governments always cause more problems than good, and on and on and on. And it was depressing. I had a rash living in the city, and finally I just decided. I was in Toronto.
Toronto, okay.
Yes. And so one summer I decided, instead of, the typical get a job and pay for college, I took a summer off and volunteered on organic farms and visited permaculture farms and communities, and had my mind blown and realized that 4-year diploma meant nothing, that really, the solutions were out there and they weren't teaching me them. That ordinary people working on the land humbly were the ones who were teaching me more than anything else. After that, I decided to spend a few years traveling, hitchhiking through Latin America, and visiting as many permaculture farms and communities as possible. And after 3 years, I really thought that I had learned everything I needed to know. And eventually I decided Ecuador, of all the countries that I had been to, was the most beautiful and most accessible for me. My partner at the time really loved the Vilcabamba area. So went to Japan for a few years to make money so that I could come back, find a piece of land, and start the dream.
Why did South America draw you so much? You spend the most time.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing was that in order to travel, I was hitchhiking around. So there's no, it's going to be in the Western Hemisphere, obviously. Just that's where I could go. I chose Latin America, and I chose, a poor country over the richer world, because I had this kind of, I'd say it's a naive dream that I was going to help change people. And, I figured it's a lot easier convincing people who don't have toilets to get a composting toilet than it
Mm,
is people who have flush toilets to
got it. To
go
change
back
that,
to the
right.
composting toilet. Yeah. Also, I've never had much wealth, so where else can you really afford to buy land? I
Mm-hmm.
don't think I could ever afford it in the northern
Right.
countries.
Yes.
So
Yes.
yeah, and I just love the Andes. They called me as soon as I started traveling into the Andes. I felt really drawn to it.
Mm-hmm. How could you not? The energy there is so powerful.
It really is.
And the ancestors. I wanted to go back, speaking of ancestors, I wanted to open our show with honoring the native peoples of where you are. And if you could tell us a little bit, as best you know, of the
Yeah.
indigenous peoples of the lands where you are situated.
Okay. Yeah. It's a tough story because the what are considered the indigenous here are the Saraguros, who are basically Quechua pioneers,
Mm-hmm.
Incan pioneers. They were
Mm-hmm.
sent here a long time ago, but actually not that long ago. When
Mm-hmm.
you really think about it, the Incas were just starting to move into these lands and try to take over these lands just before the Spanish arrived.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so as much as a Saraguro, I do respect them, and they have a lot of knowledge. At the
Mm-hmm.
same time, they're settlers too.
Mm-hmm.
And the people who I really wish I could get in touch with were the Paltas, who
Okay.
were the indigenous people here for thousands and thousands of years. They were nomadic,
Mm-hmm.
and they pretty much disappeared after the Spanish arrived. They were already having a difficult time defending their ways with
Mm-hmm.
against the Incas, but when the Spanish came and disease,
Mm-hmm.
now I have yet to meet anyone who really can
Say
uh, really connect with the Palta genealogy. So
the language or anything, right?
yeah, it's all gone. It's a tragedy.
So we want to honor the Palta peoples of the place where you are, and this we honor their ancestors who
As
remain
do I.
in some form somewhere there, in the lands and in nature there. You've been
Indeed.
on the mountain and have had hundreds of global visitors come to volunteer, live, work, and learn alongside you. And what have been some of your key learnings, having had so many people come through, and yourself having been there for nearly 2 decades, really living in a remote, the whole off-grid, off-road lifestyle.
Mhm. Yeah, it's been a difficult one, and I'd say I went through a very hard learning curve when I first got up there. It's really the ideals of that kind of lifestyle. I'm going to be dancing naked in the garden with my donkey, and everything's going to be just so easy and lovely and peaceful. And it's not. I mean, it's peaceful. Don't get me wrong. I'm there, and I'm still there for a reason. I do love it, but it was much more difficult. All those conveniences of modern society are now gone. Just if you forget to bring up something, it's a 2-hour hike back down the mountain and a 2-hour hike up the mountain. You're talking like 2,000 feet going up the hill. So it was difficult, and I made so many mistakes. Like I said earlier, I thought I'd known everything. I thought I was ready for it. I wasn't.
Mhm.
Um, and then the difficult part is actually with all those volunteers in the beginning, they
Mhm.
made every single mistake that I had made and learned from, they had to make over and over again. It
Mhm.
taught me a lot of patience.
Mhm. Mhm.
But it was worth it, just to see how other people adapted to that different way of living. And
Mhm.
some couldn't handle it and left early, but there are
Mhm.
other people who really just you
Thrived.
know rolled up their shirts and were ready to take it on.
Mhm.
And I don't think I could have done it without volunteers, especially in the beginning. I
Right.
don't have much of a volunteer program now, but it
Uh-huh.
really helped having community, having people who are in it with me, who could share the problems, share the tragedies, but also share the joy and celebrate with me
Well,
up
at that time,
there.
it was more of an intentional community where people were more living there with you on the lands.
Yeah, It went through phases. In the very beginning, there were probably about 3 people who lived with me for several years.
Mhm.
And then, there'd always be, five or more volunteers coming through.
Got it.
And then it got to a pinnacle where there were probably about 10 people who were permanent residents up there.
Mhm. Uh-huh.
And it was heaven. It really was. Um, Unfortunately, I'm a hermit. So as soon as there were too many people living there,
Right.
I had to leave. I actually moved about 15, 20-minute walk away and built a new homestead, um, just to have my peace and quiet and hermitage. But I
Uh-huh.
probably should have actually stayed with the community. I didn't realize that there was conflicts going on that were more serious than I had initially thought, and eventually the whole community kind of fell
Mhm.
apart,
Mhm.
and everybody's gone. There's a few people still living in Vilcabamba who are still great friends. Like it
Uh-huh.
didn't end, it didn't
Right.
end with any animosity at all. But just and then a lot of them, I think a lot of them were staying up there because it was beautiful and everything. But I don't think they were as committed as I was. The work is hard, and after a while, people like to they say they had the experience and move on from it.
Right. Well, because they haven't actually ever really done it. I mean, it's the one thing to, it's like having a child. You don't know what it's like until you actually have that commitment, and you can't just walk away from it if you're really
Exactly.
committed to it, right?
Yeah,
So,
and I really did. I really did. My first day after I bought the land, there's a little waterfall on that property,
mhm.
and ironic that you said having a child, because I went to that waterfall kind of as my connection with the mountain. That's
Right.
where I talked to the mountain,
Right.
and I made this sacred commitment, and I told her, like, I'm not planning on having any children ever, which is
Not
obviously turned out not to be true. But at the time, I was like, I'm not having any children ever. Like, I want this mountain to be my child. I'm going to commit 15 to 20 years to raising this mountain and making her strong and healthy again.
hmm
Um, and it was exactly like you said, just like a child, I had no idea what I was getting into.
Right.
Those first couple of years, there were moments I was watching the beautiful view and sunset, and I was just crying, being like,
Mm.
what have I gotten myself into? Especially before there was community and lots of volunteers. I spent a lot of time those first 2 years completely alone up there for
Mhm.
months at a time. And I was just like, am I
Mhm.
going to die alone on the mountain? Like, what have I done?
Mhm.
None of that came true, obviously. It was a beautiful experience in the end.
It's not such a bad thing, actually. I think that some people would actually like to die on a mountain. In any case, could you speak to deep ecology? It's often
Mhm,
attributed to Rachel Carson, the beginnings of that
mhm.
those words, and her seminal book Silent Spring. How is deep ecology different than ecology or Anthropocene environmentalism?
Yeah, all of the typical environmental groups and typical ecology is always looking outwards, right? It's
Mhm.
always looking at the environment as something separate from us. We have to save the planet and we have to help the planet, or we are destroying the planet. Um, Whereas deep ecology embraces our relationship with the planet, the fact that we are the planet and we are an ecology, and whether we live in a city or up on the mountain, we are actually affected by our environment and we affect our environment in the same way that a beaver affects their environment or a butterfly does. And deep ecology, by embracing that, realizes that everything we do on the planet not only affects the planet, but affects ourselves. And everything that's done to the planet affects us. And we're
Mhm.
all so deeply connected.
Mhm. Thank you. And then from there, how would you explain agroecology? What does this mean to you?
That's interesting because the Spanish use agroecology synonymous with organic
Mm.
agriculture,
Okay.
which I think is not correct at all.
hmm
At least from my perspective. From my perspective, agroecology is it's the same kind of like looking at ecology and understanding how ecosystems work and realizing that agricultural systems still have an ecological dimension.
hmm
Um, Often it's anti-ecological dimension. Most of like typical or even organic agriculture is a war against nature. Whether you're using synthetic pesticides or natural pesticides, you're still fighting it. Whereas agroecology is looking at typical ecological principles and then applying that to agriculture and trying to figure out how different agricultural systems could work if there's biodiversity and more complexity, how the soil biome reacts with it. It's taking agriculture out of that laboratory and out of that, agriculture versus environment or agriculture versus nature, and understanding that agriculture can be part of nature. And by using natural systems and natural principles, ecological principles, you can actually maybe not increase all the productivity, but do it in a way that benefits the biodiversity and just natural ecology.
So would you say that regenerative agriculture or indigenous agriculture, like that, is all part of more agroecology because it's respecting the interdependence of the whole?
Yeah, indeed. And it's tough when you talk about indigenous agriculture.
Well,
It
I
really,
know there's been harmful practices in that too,
yeah, of course, yeah. Everybody has their mistakes, and traditional ways are sometimes beautiful, but sometimes you're holding on to mistakes as well. However, when I look at a lot of what indigenous peoples did, not the indigenous agriculture that we know of, like when we think of indigenous agriculture, I think of, say, the Three Sisters, how the Maya loved to plant corn and beans and squash together, and they synergistically were able to work so well. And that's wonderful. But the kind of management that a lot of indigenous, the peoples that of your lands, they didn't plant fields, but they did plant within the forest, and they did manipulate the forest in just tiny ways that allowed it to be more productive for themselves, but still be completely functioning ecosystems, which is something that agriculture has never really been able to replicate. They don't seem to make functioning ecosystems. They always try to destroy the ecosystem and replace it with their system.
Probably the word indigenous agriculture is not even really a correct term to use. But Eve, hold that thought. We are going to come back and speak a little bit about that romanticization of going back to the land and sort of how that is a myth more than reality. And we'll be right back. So we're back, listeners, with Eve Zender of Sacred Sueños, forest regeneration project in the Andes Mountains. And we were talking about romanticizing going back to the land. And of course, before, during, and after the pandemic, many people have gone back to the land in some form, even if it's just to a place that's less urban than where they were living before. But we know that it's not always so romantic to go back to the lands because people are not used to working the lands, and they are often averse to or ignorant of manual labor. They don't really know what's entailed, and they're not used to really working with their hearts and hands. Is labor underrated and undervalued?
Oh, indeed. It's very undervalued. I think I just find it so kind of funny when I hear about, a lot of modern people who prefer the elevator over the stairs, prefer driving over biking or walking, and then they spend hours at the gym just stepping on steps and pushing weights and all that sort of thing. And like, I admit that there are a lot of times where I'm out there and it's raining and I'm like trying to cut for the rabbits, and I'm like, why am I doing this? Or I'm digging a trench and I'm like getting a blister, and I'm like, why do I have to do this? I would probably be very unhealthy if I didn't. Or I'd have to go to a gym and do meaningless activities in order to, stay healthy. So yeah, I do find it completely underrated. But at the same time, I can understand why a lot of people are a little averse to hard work. We get pampered. I know I did when I first started. I was very pampered teaching English in Japan, and those first blisters, and I was like, why am I doing this? And I have a lot of friends who are also back to the land, they say, but they have workers. They have a bunch of Ecuadorians getting paid
Mm,
way what they should, below what they should get paid to do
mhm,
most of the gardening and hard work for them. And then they say, oh, I've got this amazing garden and I've got all these things. Well, you don't,
mm,
Jose has all those things and you just happen to be taking his harvest and paying him money
mhm.
to do the work for him. So,
Yeah, and I think it's kind of Thich Nhat Hanh used to talk about this, that when we are not engaged in the labor of our own lives, we are disconnected in that sense
mhm.
from that labor, and that's a very important part of living, period.
Indeed, yeah.
We had talked about this hashtag, this original hashtag, and I have to bring it up, solutions-based lifestyle. And
Yes.
so we talked about whether there's an issue with viewing life as a problem to solve, because we know as we
Mhm.
speak, there are people hell-bent on trying to solve like climate change in the sense that it's going to be some kind of technological solution, rather
Yes.
than missing all of the biology, ecology connection that's actually needed. Some people want to go out and spray aerosols into the atmosphere or plant artificial trees to absorb carbon. And what is
Mhm.
a living solution to you? And what is the problem with seeing life as a problem to solve?
Yeah, and I do love the term voluntary simplicity better because it's just saying what I'm doing instead of trying to pretend I have all the solutions or pretend that I even know all the problems, to be honest. The reason why I'm doing what I'm doing and not working for Bill Gates is because I think it's better that we all are allowed to make our own decisions and be humble about what we're doing and allow other people to follow their own paths. And in their time, hopefully, they will learn what they need to learn and do what they need to do. Um,
Mhm.
at the same time, I can say that for me, living in an urban lifestyle was problematic personally. I don't think I was healthy. I don't think the air was good for me to breathe. I
Right.
felt disconnected from nature and from everything I was doing. Um, and I still see that in a lot of society.
Mhm.
I see, there's a lot of people talk about all of the reasons why you should go for a walk in nature. How it calms you down, how it helps your immune system, how it relieves stress. All of these, they say nature is the best medicine. And my argument is that nature isn't necessarily the best medicine. It's being removed from nature that is a disease, that is a
Right.
sickness.
Mhm.
And all of the stress you see people have and the conflicts that arise, and probably a lot of their sickness is
Right.
actually coming from the fact that they're disconnected with nature. Not that nature will save them,
Right.
but that the life they're living is harming them.
Right. No, definitely. I love what you have to say about that. Definitely the disconnection from nature is a disease in itself. And we see it throughout, globally, it's a problem. But, we also talked about our own time being activists for different causes and how exhausting or anger inducing activism can be. And maybe like kind of, well, a lot of things are still going on, but because this kind of activism often involves trying to change what are entrenched systems and institutions, and also people who may be corrupted, and is returning to living a simple, natural life the most critical activism we could undertake now to change the world. Do you feel
Mm. Well, I'm a bit biased, right? So of course
that?
that's how I feel.
Maybe it's true for you. Yeah.
It's
Mhm.
very true for me. It's very true for me. I was an activist, and I'm a redhead. I was in the high temper, high anger. I was gonna fight, and I could see myself probably being in jail or suicidal or something. And I feel like a lot of that activism was a manifestation of my own guilt. Because
Mhm.
here I am fighting against a nuclear power plant, but it's because I know that every time I turned my lights on, I
Mhm.
was using that nuclear power.
Mhm.
Fighting against polluting the lake, and I knew that every time I flushed my toilet, that it was going to the lake.
Mhm.
All these, I realized I was part of the very problem I was fighting, and I wanted to be the change I wanted to see in the world, as Gandhi recommended we do. And I think that was the best advice ever, is to
Mhm.
actually just look around you and go, what do I want different? What kind of world do I want to see that's different? And how can I actually do that personally? by myself, individually, with my family, with my community? How can we just start to find our roots instead of fighting for somebody else to impose us
Right.
these new laws or regulations that would make us find these roots?
Yeah. I was watching a video about the history of indigenous peoples pre-Columbus. And a lot of it was talking about, oh, we had no taxes, we had no jail, we had no ordinances. They didn't need them because they had, healthy functioning societies,
Indeed. Yeah.
working on
Yeah.
behalf of the collective. But talk about the lands as you found them. What had happened there? They were degraded lands. And if you could talk about why did no one want to live there, and share more about the cattle grazing and the burning of forests. And we know this is a great and ongoing current crisis in the Amazon and in other places of South America. So if you could speak to that.
Yeah. Well, okay. The mountains were once cloud forests and had remained that way up until about a century ago, when there was a great program to redistribute land to all the poor peons, basically, and but of course some of them got these steep hillsides up, in the middle of nowhere, and the only thing they knew was to light it on fire and try to grow in it. And they did that every year for generations. Two or three generations went by where they were trying to live off that land. But when you
Like
got
a
these
slash
steep
and
slopes,
burn technique.
yeah, slash and burn, exactly, which is what the indigenous actually did. They slashed, they burned, they lived somewhere for 10, 15 years, and then they left it. And they
Right.
didn't come back for 50 years and allowed it all to regenerate. And it was a very sustainable system. But to do it every year
In the
meant
same
that there was a
place.
lot of
Right.
erosion. And then by the time I got there, there were already very few people who were living there. Most had moved into the town and were basically just coming up to take care of the land. And the easiest thing for them was cattle, which again, the mountain wants so badly to turn back into cloud forest, and cows don't graze on trees. So every 2, 3 years, they had to light the mountain on fire again, just to burn the bush that was growing and try to get it back to square one, which technically should be grassland. But if you do it often enough, not even the grasses were coming back. Basically, when I got there, other than in the riparian zones where there still was some biodiversity, most of the mountain was just bracken fern. And even before I bought the land, I went around and was asking some of the locals about it. And one guy, he's a horse tour guide now, but his grandfather owned that piece of land in the long decades and decades ago. And he sat me down and was like, Abel is what they call me. It's like, don't do it. Don't get that land. 20 years ago was the last time that our whole family went up there, and we burnt it and tilled it, and we planted corn and beans and potatoes and grew nothing. We wasted weeks of work and nothing would grow on there. So don't do it. And for most people, it's like, thank you for that advice, I won't buy it. But for me, I'd gone into there realizing that I had a privilege, being this white boy from North America who could make the money, and I could, if I wanted to, buy very productive land from somebody, displace them, and have already my beautiful orchards and gardens. But I was young, maybe a little naive and cocky, but I think I had good intentions. I wanted to invest in something that needed to be rehabilitated. And boy, did I find it.
Right. That's that labor piece again, right? Have this commitment. I think when we speak about, when I was talking about the pandemic, and a lot of people who have gone back to the lands, and, we think about the displacing of so many indigenous peoples and how important it is to actually tend to the lands, and actually go through that labor process of what is it to help restore lands that they become healthy. Because most people kind of are in a taking position, especially in modern society. You just take from the land, never really give back. Who's giving back to the biodiversity, to the microbes in the soil, to actually, having abundant water, healthy, clean air. I mean, all of this is something that we have a personal responsibility to. And I think more of us actually need to remember that. just like an
Yes.
indigenous person, that's just their whole cosmological view of life. Those are their ancestors. These are ancestors, and it's an
Mhm.
animist way of life. But where you are, I'm just wondering, how long did it take before you started to see something perennial being able to grow? I mean, how long did that take before you started to actually see fertility coming back, soil fertility coming back?
Yeah, I'd say it's still going under that process at the moment. For the first 2 years, I was starting to doubt whether I was going to ever do anything. I would cut the bracken fern and it would sprout back, and then I would cut it again and it would sprout back, and I would just drop it and allow it to mulch. Um, and then sometime around the mid of the second year, some new things started to sprout.
Some
Just a
volunteers?
few. Yes, I
Mhm.
was at the time. I had bought, I'd gone and purchased all these biomass accumulating special permaculture seeds, grow in poor land. And at first, I was like really trying to nurture them, and they were having such a hard time.
Mhm.
By year three,
Mhm.
I was just trying to prune around them. I was cutting more organic matter in those volunteers. And
Mhm.
suddenly it dawned on me, obviously, it's the natives. They're the survivors. Like the guys who are coming up right now are the ones who are meant to be growing the organic matter and
Mhm.
producing that biomass. And I had a little bit of a mind switch. I also, when I was digging the flat spot for my house, I saw my soil profile. Um,
Mhm.
and then I could watch these roots that went out of that very acidic, it's like a pH 4.5
Oh, wow.
topsoil, and
Okay.
into the clay and around these rocks. And I realized these natives, they had some strategies. They were mining minerals from way deep
Mhm.
underneath and bringing it up above. So after that, I hardly planted any of these new, special seeds, and I
Right.
just focused on the volunteers and on heavy pruning. And
Mhm.
I would say it's still like, in between, after a while, I was like, okay, I'm going to try planting corn again. I'm going to try planting some beans again. And it was probably a good 4 or 5 years before anything was even semi-productive.
Do you have
Uh,
any idea about, you'll never probably know how many species are there now, but do you have any idea of what kind of biodiversity has been created there now? Maybe.
it went from, you know, I I have a hard time saying exactly in the beginning because I didn't know them, right? So I
Right.
could see two plants and think they were the same species that now I realize are actually completely different species, maybe not even the
Uh-huh.
same family
Right.
sometimes, they
Right.
just kind of have some mimicry.
Mm.
Um, at the moment, back then, I think there were probably about a dozen species.
Mhm.
And mostly it was bracken fern. And then when you get into the riparian zone, you'd find these other, 10, 11 species. Um, Now we have already over 100 species that we've identified,
Mhm.
and we have pictures of probably about 150 more that we still haven't found the species name for. We're
Wow,
still
that's incredible.
working on
Wow.
it. It's amazing. Yeah, it's every year, it's like there's not a year that goes by without finding a new, uh, you know, orchid, or wow, I've never seen that butterfly, or like this, just
Mhm.
about 3 months ago, a new hummingbird showed
Oh
up.
my God, that's
Beautiful,
incredible. Yeah.
majestic guy. Yeah,
The
yeah. So
habitat. Well, you
it's
have
so
spoken
rewarding.
about wanting to leave the lands like as a reserve,
Mhm.
at some point that, yeah, your purchase of lands, we've talked about land ownership, neither of us really believe in the concept of land ownership, like kind of as the
Yes.
British would define it. And that you purchase the lands mainly to be able to keep the lands also uh, pristine. Like maybe they
Yeah.
weren't pristine when you got them, they had been degraded already, but to keep them for nature itself.
Yes. A sanctuary.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. That's the plan. I only bought the first 10 hectares, about 25 acres,
Hmm.
which I promised right away to that waterfall that would never be sold.
Right.
And then a philanthropist basically bought the rest of the mountain after he saw my project and
Okay.
donated. And I'm actually living on his land, and it's the
And he
same
donated
deal.
lands. Got it.
He
And now
owns
you're on
land.
the rest. Hmm.
I'm on his property, but he doesn't want the property either. He's on the same. He loved my mission, and he's on the same. He considers it
Right.
liberated land, and he wants to make sure that for eternity, it's a sanctuary for
Mhm.
nature.
That's how you have to, I mean, unfortunately, if we were living more in harmony with nature, as nature, we wouldn't need things like this. We wouldn't need preserves or reserves or conservation. None of that would be
Yeah,
necessary. But
yeah,
until that becomes the case, worldwide, here we are. So
yeah, yeah,
you chose somewhere that is roadless, and throughout history, when the road comes, so comes destruction of nature soon follow. This, just from the
yeah.
human paradigm. And
Hmm.
what's changed where you are now? We've mentioned what's happening, that there's more and more expats, and then
Yes.
fires are still commonplace, the fires that you talked
Hmm.
about for grazing. And so could you speak about what is happening now around you, even though you have been regenerating this place and all this biodiversity has increased?
Yeah. I wrote a haiku once about how amazing it is to live up on the mountains because the roads can't make it into the steep mountains, And it was one of the reasons why I liked the land too. It was like a nice steep hill. I didn't think that road would ever make it.
Right.
But I've watched hundreds of houses built in the valley, and just recently I watched a road across the valley from me, on the mountain across
Mhm.
from me. I have a neighbor who is trying to get a road built to his property.
Uh-huh.
It obviously will not go through mine.
Right.
It's the reserve. It's now a bioreserve, and it can't be developed.
Mhm.
Um,
For
but yeah,
perpetuity, is that what, for perpetuity, is that how the laws, I mean, is that how it is?
well, perpetuity, I don't think anything is for perpetuity when you talk about these kinds of governments. And,
Uh-huh.
if they find a mineral, or if they get the right bribe, I'm sure things happen. I know I have a friend who has a reserve also in the area, and they built a cell phone tower on his
Mm,
bioreserve.
okay. Oh,
So
okay.
yeah. So, that's the thing is, like, yeah, I would love to be able to just let the land be, but I feel like it needs a steward. It needs somebody to keep the cows out, it needs somebody to protect from fire, and it needs somebody to represent it when these developers come around wanting to build their roads and houses and developments.
I understand. It makes perfect sense. Well, as long as
Yeah.
these such people exist, I always hate that term developers, because I don't know what are they developing is what I'd like to know. It doesn't make sense
True.
to me at all, the term. But another a mentor of mine, Stephen Jenkinson, who's the author of Die Wise and many other books, has said, if you love the wild, don't go there.
Hmm.
You've gone to the wild, but you've said, your response to the comment, I guess, is that land needs a steward, given the way that kind of in the Anthropocene times, there are still people who are opportunists and who have no problem raping nature or doing destruction for the sake of
Hmm.
profit or greed or whatever is the reason.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Well, for me, I love leaving the wild alone. And there are parts of the mountain that I won't touch. There are some beautiful areas that from the very beginning, like had that extra bit of biodiversity, and I won't go in. I
Hmm.
just have my little homestead where the public trail
Hmm.
meets the land, so I
Right.
can make sure the cattle don't come in and develop that one little area. But yeah, it's hard to not go to those wild spots. They're so
Mhm.
beautiful.
Right.
But at the same time, they're not wild once we build our trails into them.
Exactly. I think that's kind of that's a very indigenous perspective, right? About just because you can doesn't mean you should. And throughout history, indigenous peoples have done things where it's like, no, you don't climb that mountain. Like, for example, Chomolungma in Tibet, like known as Mount Everest. I mean, they would never climb that. Right? I mean, that was just the tradition. You did, why would you climb that? It's not meant to be climbed. Or Mauna Kea for Native Hawaiians. You don't go to the summit. You don't go, these are places that are reserved for the sacred, and it's just, we're not meant to be everywhere. And I think that's part of the Anthropocene. We can do everything unilaterally. We're not connected to the whole, and that's why it's all about DIY, or I can do it, and it's got that kind of tone to it.
Mm-hmm.
So Eve, we're going to come right back and talk a little bit more about returning to the lands, and also kind of the exodus that's going on, and the great migration, I call it, but we'll return to that in a moment. So the great exodus, and what I mean by that is all of the movement of people trying to get back to the land. I mean, still some of it still feels reminiscent of the European colonization of this continent, of Turtle
Yeah.
Island, because many left under duress, economic, social, religious oppression. They were ultimately trying to go elsewhere to find something better. It's a very familiar story. And what is the importance, do you feel, of indigeneity, making peace with home and belonging to the lands where we are?
Yeah, well, I am an expat, so I obviously wasn't as rooted, and I never was because I was born in Switzerland and only lived there my first 4 years.
Are you actually
So
Swiss by
I'm
heritage?
actually Swiss. Yes, I am. Um, so for me, I feel like it was a decades long quest to find my roots and
Mhm,
and to put them into the ground.
mhm,
Um, I do worry a little bit about this exodus that we're seeing, where people are, as much as I say I can't live in the cities, I I see what happens when people move out of the cities. And
mhm.
it's the same thing I see when people move from their home country here as expats,
Yeah,
is they're escaping, but they often bring so many of the things that they're escaping with them.
problems, right.
Yeah. And that's my worry when you hear this great exodus from the city to the countryside, is it looks like they're just suburbanifying the countryside. They're
Right.
overdeveloping, they're taking places that were more wild and making them less wild. They're building giant mansions on these properties, and I don't see it as positive. I don't feel like it's getting back to the land. It's getting back
Mhm.
on the land, maybe, but there's
Yeah,
no actual connection to the land itself, and there's
yeah.
no intention to actually be a part of that land and live humbly with that land, and to give up a lot of the conveniences and problems and conflicts that have to do with property and urban lifestyles.
I think that was true of that original European colonization, of course, of this continent. What happened here, the devastation and the genocide of indigenous peoples that happened here. It's a similar thing. I mean, right now as we speak, I'm having the lot next door over to me. They're building four houses on a lot
Yeah.
that was for one, and so we understand that. I think that every day that makes more and more sense about, if you love the wild, don't go there, makes more and more sense, because we're kind of exporting that kind of consumerist still is ending up now in the wilder spaces. And we know there's less and less of just nature to itself,
Mm-hmm.
without this Anthropocene kind of focus.
Yeah.
So I wondered, when you first arrived in Ecuador, being of European descent, like what was the journey like to forge community there? And were you considered suspect, or how long did it take before you really were accepted as someone who was a contributor, who was going to live in sacred reciprocity with the land versus
It didn't. It wasn't immediate. Now it's like it's a different world here, because there's so many expats and the place is so developed. But when I got here, there were maybe 30 old back to land hippies from who came here in the 70s and 80s, and dirt roads and no cell phones and nothing. So when they saw me, they even though I was probably poorer than a lot. I still am. I still make less money than my neighbors. Like I'm impoverished by their standards. But at the time they saw me and they thought, "Oh, rich white guy." So yeah, I got robbed the first few months, got robbed twice. And it wasn't until exactly a year after I had bought the land that, and by that time I'd already like had some good conversations with my neighbors.
Mhm,
Felt like I was getting in better relationship,
mhm.
and exactly on the 1 year anniversary, I was invited down to the little village, not Vilcabamba, but there's a little village at the bottom of the mountain where most of my neighbors live,
Right.
and they had a huge barbecue for me and a celebration, and
Oh,
they confessed that when they first started, they had a little gamble with a calendar,
yeah,
where they each put down 25 cents for a day and wrote which day that this gringo is going to give up and leave the mountain, because they didn't think this little hippie boy was going to be able to handle it, and they were almost right. There were some moments where I was like, am I going to be able to stay up here? After a year, they were like, okay, looks like Abelito's here to stay. He's built his little adobe
oh,
hut up there, and he's
in
living
your
like our
respect.
grandparents do. They had a lot more respect for me.
Mhm.
And And then as the years went by, there are times where they can't find their cattle, so I go and help look for them. Or
Mm.
there are moments where I look at my front gate and there's a pair of sunglasses hanging there that somebody left thinking it was for me, or a bunch of bananas that they'd harvested and had
Oh,
too many of that they left for me.
right.
And if I see them going by and it's raining, I give raincoats and they can come in and wait until the rain ends. And I
Mm,
feel like now, at least with the people who know me, I have
right.
a really good relationship. They do
Relationship.
joke that I live more Ecuadorian than they do, because
Uh-huh.
they remember what their parents and grandparents, how they lived on dirt floors up in the mountain, and they see me do it and they just laugh, like we're all trying to get to the United States so we can have a
Ah,
lot of money and do all these things. And here's this gringo who's like living like our grandparents. But
yeah.
yeah, it did take a while. But I feel like, if you're honest and good, they do see it and they recognize that and
Yeah.
appreciate it.
And they respect it, which is beautiful. But it takes
Yeah.
time, right? And you earned it. Of course, you earned it. Alden, baby boy, just came into your life. And
Yes.
these days, children and youth spend an average of 6 hours on a screen. Your children, your I don't
I have a
remember the
daughter as well.
daughter's name, yeah, but
Yeah, Ayla.
my I
Ayla.
yeah. So
Yeah.
your children have probably never seen a device, or you probably keep it from them. And so, what do you wish for your two children?
Ah, I'm not going to. I wish them happiness. I am not going to try to impose my lifestyle and everything about what I believe in on
Mhm.
them. Um, I like that Khalil Gibran wrote a beautiful poem on children, and I'm not going to be able to quote it. I don't have
Mhm.
the intellectual capacity for that. But to sum it up, he basically says that we are the bow, and our goal is just to give them that impulse, but they're the arrows. And we have to accept where that arrow will fly and where it lands.
Mhm.
So my daughter has seen a screen and
Mhm.
she's done a little bit of like a few learning games on the screen. Because in the beginning, I was like, no screen, no nothing, she's going to learn just nature. And
Right.
I realized I'm just going to create a rebel by prohibiting her from being able to connect with what the rest of her society is going to connect with.
Right.
I can isolate her now, but eventually she's going to have friends who are going to be on these machines. She's going to be looking for work that is going to depend on these machines. And I don't want to deprive that of her necessarily. At the same time, I'm not getting Wi-Fi on the mountain for her, like I I'm not going to go that far,
Right.
I'm
Right.
I am going to I do allow her to see what modern society is like and to participate it in a small way so she
Right.
doesn't think that I've deprived anything or I've hidden anything from her.
Right.
I just hope she gets inspired enough. A good example is actually my own life. And my parents weren't going back to the land because they wanted to. They were just very poor immigrants.
Mhm.
My father worked on other dairy farms, and in exchange, we got a small house and a gardens and animals, and my mother did all that.
Okay.
And until I was 10, and then she got a job, and then we went from homemade bread to Wonder Bread. And and I look back on the pre-Wonder Bread days as some of the
Fondly.
best days of my life. Um, and I've talked to my mother, and she admits that like those were the best days when she could be home with her
Right.
children, working in the garden. But she believed that she needed to go make money, for our futures. And I
Right.
understand that pressure. I'm really feeling that pressure right now of like financial insecurity. It's a lot easier going without a meal if you have to when you're just by yourself. But when you have children, you start to
Right.
worry about them and their future. So
Mhm.
I understand why my mother did it. But at the same time, I look back and go, wow, those were the best years of my life. And I obviously still had some of that, even when I was living in Toronto and thinking I was going to like buy a sports utility vehicle and get a regular job and work for an NGO or whatever I thought at the time. I had my epiphany and went right back to that childhood experience and how beautiful and pure
Right.
it was. So like I am fully aware that my daughter is probably going to, in 10 years from now, be a complete rebel, be on
Mhm.
that screen way more than I'm comfortable with,
Right.
have dreams that make me want to vomit. But I hope that there will come a time where she does
Remember,
reconnect with that old life and appreciates it. And I think she will. I think she
remember
will.
something foundational about our life. Yeah, that early foundation. And from there, I want to go into a conversation on wild versus manicure. Speaking of,
Mm,
children, but your comments on both, because indigenous peoples, as we discussed earlier, they maintained these lands since time immemorial, and most would not be able to recognize their hand in it because they
yes.
left it so pristine and it was so invisible, and then the way they were touching upon the lands was completely in connection with spirit. So a
Mhm.
well-tended Zen garden is a beautiful
Yes.
energetic space, an example, I think, of humans being in harmony with nature. But could you speak to the difference between stewardship and manicure? And is there ever a place for manicure?
I guess I am not going to say there's no place for manicure. There is something very beautiful and artistic about some garden designs, and how the flowers are the patterns and all of that.
Or a
And
well-trimmed tree, right? I mean,
it's
that's
very pretty, exactly. Very pretty. And by our standards, everything has to be. You look at permaculture, and all the permaculture teachers are so wonderfully manicured. It makes me kind of jealous how like ruly it is versus how unruly my style is. Um, but I value the indigenous style where they could disappear. And like you look at the Amazon, there's no hint that there was once
right.
a civilization there, and yet when you look deeply, you realize that everything has been touched and is still working in that way. And that's my dream. My dream is that when I leave that mountain, that people will come up and they won't even realize that I was up there,
In
that
there.
there's no trace left. There's
Mhm.
something beautiful about it. However, I have to admit it's not as productive. It's easy for just a little family. We grow a lot of our own things, but we do come down and buy a big bag of flour, for example.
Mhm.
Like, man, trying to grow wheat in a on scale without it being manicured,
Mhm.
very difficult, very
Mhm.
difficult. So I do understand that, you know, if our demographics were much more sparse,
Mhm.
then maybe we could do this easily and sustainably because we'd be able to just kind of do what they did, walk around and pick what's in season at the time.
Right.
um, but if for a lot of people, who want market gardens, who are trying to feed all those folks in the city, I don't know if my style can be easily adapted and still produce in that kind of quantity that's necessary to feed all those people who aren't doing it.
Right.
Maybe if every single one of us started doing it, it would
Yeah.
be a different deal.
There'll be
Um,
enough. We know there's plenty enough to feed the world if everyone was growing
was
food, right?
If we were all tending the land, it would be a different deal. But because there's such a small percentage of us, I do understand that there is room for that manicure, that agriculture in order to do it.
Mhm.
Um, Yeah, and I think when I do my consulting, I do ask people how manicured they want it, and I try to bend for it, just because the wild is also, it's confusing and intimidating, and if you don't have a real connection with it and know every species and why they're there and what they're doing and how they're functioning, you can just look at it and be overwhelmed by the greenery and not recognize one from the other. And I feel like a typical garden or like well landscaped area is a lot more accessible for
Right.
people.
Yeah, it's kind of a
So often,
transitional space, right? To get people reconnected to the lands and even being able to see, to be able to observe and be able to identify this species is different than that species. And, it's really those powers of observation for many have to be recultivated.
indeed, indeed, exactly,
We've
exactly.
spoken about you coming down off the mountain and back kind of into the modern world to some degree to be able to help teach people. We spoke about some people need to come down off the mountain and some people need to ascend it. And you meet somewhere halfway in the middle for the sake of harmony and balance in the world. What are your visions for teaching people now? And what do you wish to impart to them, given your lived experience on the mountain?
That's a really good question. And
So
I
if
ask myself that all the time because, there's always that imposter syndrome, especially when you look at these beautiful teachers like Jeff Lawton, who've got these immaculate gardens and has all the best things to say, and the videos are so well edited. And I'm like, what do I have that can contribute? What I have, I think, is that more wild nature, is the ecology inspired
Mhm.
approach to landscaping and stewarding the land. Um, I think my goals are going to be humble. I'm right now putting together kind of a short little podcast course,
Mhm.
and then I want to connect that with webinars,
Mhm.
so that people who have the vision and have the land and want to apply it but don't know where to begin can go, listen to the podcast a little bit at a time, and on a regular basis, as a group, we can come together and apply it to their own lands and their own projects. On top of that, I think I might be an okay consultant.
Mhm.
Anybody has any questions or any issues can get a hold of me, and I will try to work my way with them on that. Uh, Beyond that, I'm not sure. I have to see how successful I am and how many people are actually interested in hearing this approach
I
versus
think there's
the
a lot
norm.
of people. I think there are actually, you'll find that there's a lot of people. I think it's an exponential thing happening. But, I know right now you're helping the Soil Sponge Collective's community grassroots group doing regenerative work here on Tongva lands and this area. You're helping people design food forests here. And in the process, we found that some people were living near large oil fields, or they're having to address toxicity because they live near a freeway or the port. What about bringing regeneration to the urban areas inspires you?
Oh, it's really inspiring, because this is where the people live.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're trying to get a cultural shift to be, real reconnected with nature and have a different value of nature, those are the people I need to try to communicate with, even though I just want to hide on the mountain, to be honest. I
Versus
just want to
preach to the
hide up there.
choir, you mean? Versus preach to the
Yeah,
choir.
yeah. Um, but these are challenges. I get we talked about the exodus being an issue. So it's like, how can people feel at home in the city where they really now are connected to, but do it in a way where they are bringing nature back and valuing it and regenerating it. and and then there's the biggest challenge of like this soil toxicity. We've got all the traffic and freeways and things. I started studying all of that. I got it deep into the rabbit hole. And there are solutions. It's pretty amazing what the microbiome can do. They break down everything. And in terms of heavy metals, there are some just simple techniques like keeping your soil as alkaline as can be, or as neutral to alkaline as can be. um,
Mhm.
Focusing on fruits that those heavy metals can't reach that as high, making raised beds if you have to, in order to avoid that soil if it's really that toxic. But I really do see solutions. I really do see that it's completely possible. There's some hurdles to overcome, and I don't want to tell anybody to just throw carrots in the ground and they'll be okay. Like, we should get the soil tested and we should find out how to
Mhm.
remedy it and regenerate it. And the more we learn, the easier it's going to be. And
Mhm.
I'm hoping that it becomes universal, that your collective inspires so many more people to do
Mhm.
what you're doing. And you're the template. You're learning those approaches.
Well,
I'm really
Eve,
excited.
Thank you so much for joining us on the show and for making that commitment to the mountain that you did long ago, and that you did stick it out. Through all of the trials and the errors and so forth. We really appreciate and value all that you've learned, because people need to learn from someone like that who's actually um, lived that way. Um, there's something to be said for having actually done it experientially. How can listeners stay in contact with you and learn about what you're doing in the future, join your future podcasts or your webinars? What are the ways for them to connect with you now?
I would say the best way is through our website, which is
Mhm.
sierraicielo.org. You'll have it in the show notes, I hope.
Yes, it will be in
Yeah,
the.
I would say that's the best way. My partner does keep up with the Instagram and the Facebook a
Mhm.
little bit, but because of our remote
Right.
nature, we do try to stay off the screen and really just whenever we come down to it, whatever we need to do to update the website and throw a few things on the social medias. Um, but yeah, if you just check in on the website or join the Facebook community,
Mhm.
or the Instagram community, then I think you'll be able to see what we're doing and follow us.
Thank you again, Eve. And listeners, if any of this intrigues you, definitely do reach out to Eve, especially if you live in a urban setting and are looking to try to bring regeneration and restore where you are, and also in harmony with Indigenous peoples where you are.
Indeed.
So thank you again, Eve, and
Thank you so much.
more power to you on the mountain. Thank you.
Thank
And
you.
out, back out into the world. Yeah.
Yes, awesome. All right, thanks a lot for having me.
Thank you again.